It was nearly midnight when Jake Miller drove toward another night shift. Rain fell softly on the empty road. Then the road closed. Red and blue lights flashed near an old utility station by the harbor, and there, in the rain, stood a dog. A military K9, injured, bleeding from his front leg, yet refusing to move. No barking, no panic. Just standing guard over something no one else could see. Why would a wounded dog stay on his feet while bleeding out? What danger had he already stopped, without the town ever knowing, and why? Only when Jake stepped closer did the dog finally collapse, like a soldier who wouldn't fall until the mission was complete. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below and subscribe. Rain pressed softly against the harbor town, steady and patient. The kind that soaked into old wood and older bones. Wind from the bay carried salt and cold through empty streets, while low clouds hung heavy above warning lights that flickered without urgency. Jake Miller was already late in his head before he was late on the clock. At 47, time no longer felt like minutes and hours. It felt like margins. Margins between rent and groceries. Between a job kept and a job lost. He drove an aging pickup with a dented door and a heater that worked when it wanted to. The cab smelled faintly of oil, damp fabric, and coffee gone cold. Jake's shoulders were broad but rounded forward, shaped by years of warehouse labor and longer years of carrying things he never spoke about. His hair was cut short, gray threaded through what had once been dark, and a trimmed beard framed a jaw that looked stern, only because it had learned restraint. His eyes were tired but alert, the eyes of someone who had learned that danger often arrived quietly. He was headed to the night shift at the cold storage warehouse near the docks, a job that paid just enough to keep his life from sliding backward. The route along the levee was the fastest way in, the one he always took when storms slowed traffic everywhere else. When he rounded the final bend, the road ended in color, red and blue bleeding into rain. Barricades cut across the asphalt, engines idled low. Jake eased to a stop, checked the clock out of habit, and exhaled through his nose. Beyond the barricades stood the old utility station, a squat concrete building too close to the water. Patched and reinforced so many times, it no longer looked like it belonged to a single era. Beneath it ran a web of aging gas lines and electrical conduits feeding a cluster of wood-framed houses, a small elementary school, and a nursing home whose windows glowed softly in the distance. After days of relentless storms, tonight was the final inspection before the system could be fully reactivated. Machines had already cleared most checks, but storms had a way of leaving behind problems machines struggled to name. Ranger arrived without sound. He was a military K9, a Belgian Malinois built for endurance rather than size, compact and powerful. His tan coat darkened by rain, and his black mask giving his face a permanent look of focus. At 5 years old, Ranger moved with the economy of something trained to conserve energy. His amber eyes cut through glare and motion alike. The harness on his back was scuffed and worn, leather softened by years of work. There was no handler at his side now, no voice guiding him, only training, instinct, and discipline layered so deeply they had become one. Ranger stopped near the station's access trench, body tightening, head lowering. The smell reached him first, not sharp, not obvious, but layered and wrong. Gas, trapped where it should not be, held in a pocket created by subtle shifts. Underground. Beneath it, a second warning pulsed. Irregular electrical vibration where moisture had breached aging insulation. Separately, each anomaly might have registered as tolerable. Together, under storm conditions, they formed a pattern Ranger had been trained never to ignore. If the system restarted on schedule, pressure would force the trapped gas to migrate through old channels, meeting unstable current not in a single explosion, but in slow ignition, embers creeping through crawl spaces, walls, and ceilings. A fire that would not announce itself until it was already everywhere. Ranger moved into position, angling his body to block the narrow approach technicians used to access the restart panel. His stance was deliberate, weight balanced, tail low and still. When one technician stepped forward, Ranger issued a short, controlled bark. Clear, unmistakable. The team paused. Voices rose briefly behind him, confusion brushing against urgency. Under storm protocols, any mixed alert. Gas instability combined with electrical irregularity required a full hold, no restart, no shortcuts. The technicians knew the rule. They stepped back as orders were relayed to isolate the lines and cut power completely. Ranger did not move. The storm had weakened more than soil. Above the access trench, a rusted support beam groaned under the accumulated strain of water and vibration. The sound was low, almost swallowed by rain. Metal trembled, shifted. Ranger sensed it an instant before it failed. The support gave way. A jagged strip of steel tore loose and dropped, striking Ranger's front leg with brutal precision. Pain flared, immediate and blinding. Blood spread darkly across wet concrete. Ranger staggered once, breath hitching. He did not retreat. He adjusted his stance, compensating without conscious thought, planting himself again in the path. Another bark, stronger now, forced the team farther back as switches were thrown and valves closed. Power was cut. Pressure bled away with a long hiss that seemed to thin the night. Only when confirmation came, lines isolated, systems secured, risk neutralized, did Ranger allow himself to fold. He lowered himself carefully, as if even collapsing required discipline. Jake had been watching from his truck, rain tapping steadily against the windshield. He had seen injuries before. He had seen men stay upright long after their bodies demanded otherwise. The image before him fit into a shape his mind recognized too easily. He stepped out of the cab, boots splashing, hands open and empty, stopping several paces away. Up close, Ranger looked smaller, all sinew and resolve pressed thin by blood loss. Jake knew better than to crowd a working dog, especially one in pain. He stayed where he was, breathing slow, aware of the strange tightness in his chest. Sarah Klein approached with measured urgency, a radio clipped to her rain jacket. In her late 30s, she was lean from years of emergency work. Auburn hair pulled into a ponytail that rain had already begun to loosen. Freckles stood out against her pale skin under the lights. Her expression was calm, practiced, the face of someone used to making decisions while everyone else waited. As the town's emergency coordinator, she had spent the storm moving between shelters and repair sites, sleeping only when circumstances allowed. "Hold back," she said gently to Jake, meeting his eyes for a moment. There was no suspicion there, only caution. "He's done his job. We'll take it from here." Jake nodded. He did not step away. Ranger's eyes shifted toward him briefly. Something in his rigid focus eased, not trust, not yet, but recognition of stillness. Sarah noticed the change. She crouched near the wound without touching, assessing, speaking softly as medics moved in. Jake had seen that posture before, not on a dog, but on men who stayed upright long after their bodies asked them to stop. The kind who didn't sit down until someone else said it was safe. He hadn't thought about that night in years. He hadn't planned to tonight. As Ranger was lifted onto a stretcher, the urgency around them faded. Vehicles rolled away. Sirens died into the rain. The neighborhood beyond the station slept on, unaware of the quiet disaster that would never arrive. Jake glanced at the time again. He was late now, properly late. The warehouse would not wait. He knew the rules. He also knew he wasn't leaving yet. He watched the ambulance doors close, red light washing across Ranger's still form. Jake didn't know the dog's name. He only knew this: whatever that animal had been guarding mattered enough to bleed for. And somehow, that felt familiar. The rain fell heavier as the road remained closed. Jake stood there, soaked and silent, understanding something he hadn't in a long time. Some watches did not end when the shift did. Some soldiers, on 4 legs or 2, only allowed themselves to fall when the mission was truly done. Several hours after the roadblocks were lifted and the town returned to uneasy sleep, the field clinic remained awake. Long after the emergency lights outside the utility station were shut down, Ranger lay inside a converted municipal garage, the air humming softly with generators and portable lamps. Midnight had passed. Morning was still far away. The clinic smelled of antiseptic layered over old oil and damp concrete. Rainwater pooled near the entrance where boots tracked it in and out. Ranger was brought through the doorway on a canvas stretcher, his tan coat matted dark along his front leg, where blood had soaked through. His breathing was fast but measured, each rise of his chest controlled, deliberate, as if he were rationing strength rather than losing it. The moment they set him down, Ranger shifted, not to flee, not to attack. He repositioned himself so that his body faced the open doorway, injured leg angled behind him, shoulders squared. His muscles locked into place, every line of him alert. When a medic knelt too close, Ranger lifted his head and issued a low, precise warning. No snap, no bark, just enough to stop the movement. The message was clear. Do not cross. Sarah Klein stood several steps back, watching carefully. Without her rain jacket, her lean frame looked sharper under the overhead lights. She was tall, narrow-shouldered, with auburn hair pulled into a tight knot that left faint wisps curling at her temples. Freckles dotted her pale skin, more visible now that exhaustion had thinned the color from her face. Sarah had spent years coordinating emergency response: fires, floods, winter evacuations. She recognized panic when she saw it. This was not panic. He's not refusing care, she said quietly, eyes never leaving Ranger's. He's holding a position. A younger medic hesitated near the supply table. Evan Brooks was in his late 20s, slim, with sandy hair plastered to his forehead, and eyes that still carried urgency too openly. He had trained for trauma response, knew bleeding when he saw it, and the numbers running through his head did not look good. He's losing blood, Evan said, voice tight. If we don't stabilize that leg, I know, Sarah replied. But if we rush him, he'll escalate. And if he escalates, we lose him faster. They tried adapting instead of advancing. The lights were lowered, voices dropped. Someone slid a blanket across the floor, not toward Ranger, but into his peripheral space, a non-threatening presence. Ranger did not move. His gaze flicked once to the cloth, then returned to the doorway. He adjusted his stance by inches, keeping the entrance clear. Blood continued to seep from the wound, slow and steady. It was during those quiet, careful minutes that fragments of truth began to surface, not announced, not declared, just assembled from pieces people carried in without realizing they mattered. A call sign spoken by an MP under his breath, a timestamp on a field report dated 3 days earlier, a pause whenever someone mentioned the word handler. Ranger's handler had not come back from the storm. The details emerged carefully, as if saying them too quickly would break something. Ranger and his handler had been deployed outside the evacuation zone when conditions deteriorated faster than forecasts predicted. Wind speeds doubled, terrain shifted, visibility collapsed. They were working a remote valve station when the surge hit hardest. The handler had gone down shielding Ranger from debris long enough to transmit an extraction signal. The signal was received, the handler was not. Since that night, Ranger had not disengaged. In the structure that governed him, the final command had never been cleared. The mission remained open. Waiting was not grief. Waiting was obedience. When someone near the doorway spoke the word handler aloud, Ranger's ears twitched. A sound slipped from his throat. Low, broken, not quite a whine. His eyes stayed fixed on the space beyond the threshold. He did not understand death. He understood absence. Jake Miller stood just outside the clinic, leaning against the wall where shadows pooled. His jacket was still damp from the night air, sleeves pushed up as if he had forgotten to lower them. At 47, Jake carried himself with the quiet heaviness of someone accustomed to staying out of the way. His beard was trimmed short, silver threading through dark, framing a face shaped by restraint rather than anger. He had called the warehouse. The supervisor had sighed and said they would talk tomorrow. Jake accepted that without argument. From where he stood, he watched Ranger hold the line. Jake had worked alongside a K-9 once, years ago, in a different war and a different life. He remembered the discipline, the way commands created order where fear could not. When that order vanished, men unraveled, dogs waited. Sarah noticed him there and approached, keeping her movements slow. "You've seen this before," she said. It was not a question. Jake nodded once. "He's not guarding the room," he said quietly. "He's guarding the absence." Inside the clinic, Ranger shifted as a medic took half a step forward. The warning was immediate, controlled, exact. Sarah raised her hand. The medic froze. "We can't sedate him heavily," Sarah said, addressing the room. "Shock risk is too high with that blood loss. And even if we could, she paused, choosing her words. You don't end a watch by force and expect trust to survive it. Hours passed measured in drip rates and shallow breaths. Pressure dressings were prepared but not applied. Fluids ran only when Ranger allowed the line to be placed, eyes never leaving the doorway. When someone stepped between him and that space, his body tensed until they moved aside. Near dawn, an older MP arrived with a folder tucked under his arm. Thomas Hale was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and a mustache gone mostly gray. A knee injury made his movements deliberate, but his presence carried authority without volume. He had known Ranger's handler, not closely, but enough. He hasn't stood down, Hale said softly, after taking in the scene. Sarah shook her head. Hale set the folder on a table and opened it. Inside were after-action notes, a photograph, and a single metal tag attached to a worn cord. He picked up the tag, turned it once, then placed it on the floor a few feet from Ranger. Not close enough to challenge him, not far enough to be ignored. Ranger's gaze dropped. His breathing stuttered. He took one careful step forward, then stopped. His front leg shook violently now, pain no longer fully contained. Still, he did not cross the line he had drawn. Jake watched, heart tightening. He recognized the moment, the thin edge between holding and breaking. He had stood there himself once, waiting for an order that never came, convinced that moving on his own would mean leaving someone behind. He needs the mission closed, Jake said quietly. Sarah looked at him. By whom? Jake did not answer. He didn't know if the answer was him. He only knew that waiting forever was killing Ranger faster than blood loss. As first light crept through the high windows, Ranger's eyes left the doorway for the first time, just long enough to glance at the tag. Then they returned to the space beyond. The line remained intact. The man he was waiting for did not come back. And so, the watch continued. Jake Miller did not step into the clinic right away. This was no longer a standoff. It was a memory unfolding. He stood near the threshold, hands resting loosely at his sides, eyes adjusting to the fluorescent light that flattened everything it touched. The space was quieter now. Dawn had thinned the darkness outside, and with it, the urgency of the night. The generators hummed steadily. Somewhere behind him, a kettle clicked off. The clinic no longer felt like a place of resistance. It felt like a place holding its breath. Ranger noticed Jake immediately, not with aggression, with calculation. The dog's body remained angled toward the doorway, front leg drawn in tight, the tremor barely contained. His ears pivoted slowly, not searching for threat, but measuring intent. Ranger had learned long ago the difference between hands that reached and hands that waited. Jake took one slow breath and stayed where he was. He had just heard the rest of the story. Sarah Klein told it plainly, without ceremony, standing near the supply counter as she rinsed dried blood from her hands. Under the clinic lights, she looked older than she had the night before, still tall and lean, auburn hair pulled back tight, freckles standing out against skin thinned by exhaustion. Her voice carried the steadiness of a woman used to explaining hard truths when emotions complicated everything. Handler went down 3 nights ago, she said. Storm surge, terrain failure. Ranger stayed with him until extraction was forced. Jake nodded once. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. The shape of the loss was already familiar. He had lost his K-9 partner the same way. Different place, different war, same unfinished ending. The memory rose without permission. Heat instead of rain. Dust instead of wind. A narrow corridor where commands came fast, and clarity arrived too late. His dog, young, fast, trained better than anyone ever admitted, had gone forward when Jake hesitated half a second too long. The blast closed the space between them. When the smoke thinned, the leash in Jake's hand was slack. No ceremony, no goodbye, just a report and an order to move. Jake had never been good at moving. Inside the clinic, Ranger shifted as a medic edged forward. The warning sound surfaced low in his chest, controlled, deliberate. Sarah lifted a hand. The medic froze. Jake moved then. Not like a rescuer, not like authority. He approached the way soldiers approached one another after chaos. Slow, deliberate, without sudden intent. He stopped several feet away and lowered himself carefully, first into a crouch, then onto one knee. The concrete pressed cold through his jeans. He removed his gloves and set them aside, palms open, visible. Ranger watched everything. Jake did not meet the dog's eyes. He kept his gaze lowered, angled slightly away, voice even when he spoke. "I'm not here to move you," Jake said quietly, "and I'm not here to take your post." The words were not commands, they were recognition. Ranger's growl did not deepen. It did not disappear either, but something in it loosened. Jake shifted his weight, making himself smaller. He remembered the cadence, the one used when pain was present but adrenaline still held the body upright. Too fast startled, too slow sounded uncertain. He found the space between. "He didn't leave you," Jake continued. "He finished what he could, and he trusted you to hold the rest." The words landed. Ranger's ears tipped forward. His breathing changed. Not calm, not yet, but less sharp. His eyes flicked from the doorway to Jake's hands, then back again. Sarah realized she had stopped breathing. "There's a moment after," Jake said. "After the noise stops, after the orders run out." His voice stayed level. "That's the hardest part." The memory pressed harder now. Jake felt it tighten in his chest, the familiar ache he had learned not to fight. "You wait," he said, "because standing down feels like leaving." Ranger's growl broke, not into silence, but into something uneven, fractured. The sound that followed was not a warning. It was confusion. Jake lifted his eyes just enough to meet Ranger's, not challenging, not pleading. Present. "You did your job," Jake said. "You're allowed to breathe now." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Ranger exhaled, not dramatically. Just one breath released through his nose, long, unsteady. His shoulders dropped a fraction. The growl faded away. Jake felt it then. Not relief, but the quiet weight of a goodbye he never had a chance to say. No one moved. Ranger shifted his weight and, for the first time since arriving at the clinic, turned his head away from the doorway. The line he had guarded dissolved, not abandoned, but released. Jake did not touch him. He stayed kneeling, hands resting on his thighs, posture open. He knew better than to rush what had taken days to hold together. Ranger's injured leg finally gave way. Slowly, carefully. He lowered himself onto his side with the control of something that had waited far past endurance. Pain surged once, sharp and undeniable, and this time he did not fight it. A medic stepped forward. Ranger did not react. Sarah moved in, her motions precise now that permission had been granted. Pressure was applied. Orders were given. The clinic exhaled all at once. Jake remained where he was until the room filled with quiet motion again. Only then did he rise slowly, joints protesting, and step back. Ranger's eyes followed him briefly. Jake met them once more and nodded. Not a promise, not a farewell. Just recognition. Some weights could only be understood by those who had stood them. The clinic settled into a different kind of silence once Ranger lay on his side. Not the tense quiet of resistance, but the fragile stillness that followed surrender. Portable lights hummed overhead, casting pale halos on concrete walls. Outside, morning traffic began to move again, unaware that something fragile was being decided inside a former garage. Dr. Helen Moore arrived just after sunrise. She was in her early 60s, short and compact, with silver hair pulled into a low bun, and hands that moved with the unhurried confidence of long experience. Her face bore fine lines earned from years of concentration rather than age alone. Dr. Moore had served as a veterinary surgeon for working dogs for decades. Police K-9s, search and rescue teams, military units passing through on joint operations. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush. When she entered a room, urgency adjusted itself around her. She knelt beside Ranger, examining the injured front leg without touching it at first. Eyes tracking muscle tension, blood flow, micro movements that revealed more than any monitor. Ranger watched her once, then looked away, trusting Jake's continued presence more than any white coat. "The wound is deep," Dr. Moore said finally, standing and pulling off her gloves. Her voice was steady, careful. Metal tore through muscle and grazed connective tissue. If we wait too long, there's a serious risk of permanent loss of function in that leg. Sarah stood nearby, arms crossed loosely, auburn hair now falling free of its knot, soft curls framing a face gone pale with fatigue. "Sedation?" she asked. Dr. Moore shook her head slowly. "Heavy anesthesia right now is dangerous. He's lost too much blood, and his stress levels are still elevated. We could stop the pain and stop his heart with it." Jake listened without interrupting. He stood a few feet away, back against the wall, arms folded loosely, posture relaxed but unmoving. His beard framed a mouth that stayed neutral, but his eyes were alert, absorbing every word. He understood trade-offs. He had lived inside them once. "So, we're in between," Sarah said. Dr. Moore nodded. "We can attempt a temporary bandage, clean the wound, pack it lightly, stabilize the leg. It won't fix everything. But it may buy us time." Ranger shifted slightly as if responding to the word time. His breathing remained shallow but even. Jake took one step closer and stopped, careful not to crowd him. "I'll stay," Jake said quietly. No one questioned it. Time began to stretch. Jake did not speak much after that. He didn't offer reassurances or encouragements. He simply remained where Ranger could see him, seated on the floor a few feet away, legs bent, hands resting loosely on his knees. The concrete seeped cold through his clothes. He welcomed it. Cold kept him present. Minutes passed, then more. Every so often, Ranger's muscles tightened, anticipating movement. Each time, Jake remained still. No commands, no signals, just presence. The clinic staff worked around them in a careful orbit. Gauze was prepared, saline warmed. Dr. Moore moved with precision, pausing whenever Ranger's breathing changed. She watched Jake almost as closely as she watched the dog, noting the effect his stillness had on Ranger's posture. "You've done this before," she said quietly, not accusing, just observing. Jake nodded once. "A long time ago?" Ranger's ears flicked at the sound of Jake's voice but did not rise. That alone was progress. The first touch came slowly. Dr. Moore placed her hand near Ranger's shoulder, not on the wound, testing tolerance. Ranger tensed, a low sound beginning in his chest. Jake did not move. "I'm here," Jake said evenly, not loud, not soft, just present. The sound faded before it fully formed. Dr. Moore proceeded inch by inch. The wound was flushed carefully, debris removed, blood flow assessed. Ranger flinched once, sharp and sudden, pain breaking through discipline. Jake leaned forward slightly, stopping himself before instinct carried him too far. "You don't have to be strong right now," he said, voice steady. "You already were." Ranger's breathing hitched, then slowed again. The temporary bandage went on in layers: pressure, support, stabilization. It was not elegant, it was not permanent, but it held. By the time Dr. Moore stepped back, sweat beaded at her hairline. "This buys us time," she said. "Not certainty, but time." Jake nodded. He understood the value of that word better than most. Hours later, the clinic thinned. Some staff were relieved. Others drifted back to their posts. The sun climbed higher. Jake's phone vibrated once in his pocket. He didn't check it. He knew what it would be. The warehouse would have logged his absence by now. Another mark against reliability. Another conversation waiting. He accepted that quietly. Ranger shifted again, settling deeper into the floor. Tension no longer locked into every muscle. Jake stayed. No urging, no authority, just presence. Ranger allowed the bandage to remain. He did not pull at it. He did not test it. He breathed around it, as if learning a new boundary. Dr. Moore watched him once more before leaving. "Sometimes," she said, almost to herself, "the hardest wound isn't the one we can see." Jake met her gaze. "I know." By late morning, Ranger slept. Not deeply, not freely, but enough. His chest rose and fell in a steadier rhythm. The line he had guarded was gone now, replaced by something quieter. It was a small step, but it was the one that kept him alive. By mid-morning, the story had slipped beyond the walls of the clinic and into the streets of the harbor town, carried not by sirens or headlines, but by quiet conversations and concerned glances. Someone had seen the K9 ambulance pull in before dawn. Someone else had heard that the dog who stopped a disaster the night before was hurt badly. In a town shaped by tides and long memories, news moved the way weather did, slowly at first, then everywhere. No one crowded the clinic. That surprised Sarah most. She stood near the open bay door, sleeves rolled, auburn hair falling loose now, in tired waves against her shoulders. Freckles dark against skin, drained by another sleepless stretch. She had expected questions, demands, the kind of anxious curiosity that turned emergencies into spectacles. Instead, people came and stopped at the curb. They looked, they nodded, and then they did something else. They brought light. A fisherman named Lewis Carver arrived first, setting a portable work lamp near the doorway so the shadows inside softened without harsh glare. Lewis was in his late 50s, tall and wiry, beard gone white at the chin, hands scarred by rope and salt. He didn't ask permission. He didn't step inside. He simply adjusted the angle until the light felt right and stepped back, hat in hand. Then came warmth. A retired school teacher, Marjorie Hill, short and round with silver hair tucked neatly beneath a knit cap, placed folded blankets on a chair by the entrance. Her movements were gentle, deliberate, as if she were back in her classroom preparing a reading corner. She smiled once at Sarah and said, "For later," before returning to her car. Others followed. A young dock worker dropped off a box of chemical heat packs, explaining in a low voice that they worked even when the power didn't. A cafe owner sent over thermoses of soup and coffee, handwritten notes taped to the lids. No one crossed the threshold without being invited. No one asked when Ranger would be fixed. Inside, Ranger slept in shallow cycles, waking when sounds changed, settling again when they didn't. The temporary bandage held. His breathing stayed even. Jake remained seated on the floor where he had been since dawn, back against the wall, boots stretched out in front of him, hands resting loosely in his lap. His phone vibrated again. He ignored it. Time had taken on a different measure. Dr. Helen Moore returned around noon, her compact frame moving with the same unhurried confidence as before, silver hair secured, eyes sharp behind thin-framed glasses. She assessed Ranger's vitals and the bandage without touching, then nodded once. "This is working," she said quietly. "Not forever, but long enough." "For what?" Sarah asked. "For the safest option," Dr. Moore replied. "If we can keep his stress down, keep blood loss controlled, we can move him later for surgery under controlled anesthesia. Rushing him now would cost us more than we'd gain." The word spread without instruction. Patience became the rule. People adjusted around it. Traffic rerouted further down the block. The marina delayed fuel deliveries. The school down the road held recess indoors, teachers explaining that quiet helped everyone today. At the nursing home, staff drew curtains on the street-facing windows to keep activity from spilling inward. No one demanded action. No one tried to decide for Ranger. Jake watched this from his place on the floor, something unfamiliar tightening behind his ribs. He had known towns that fractured under pressure, people scrambling to be seen doing something. This was different. This was restraint. He understood it because he had once lived by it. Long nights when staying put mattered more than moving. Sarah noticed him watching and sat beside him, leaving space. Up close, she looked more worn than her steady voice suggested. Dark circles beneath hazel eyes, faint lines at the corners of her mouth, earned by years of responsibility. She was tall and narrow-shouldered, built for endurance rather than force. "They're choosing to wait," she said softly. Jake nodded. "That takes more strength than most people think." Outside, a boy named Eli Turner stood with his mother near the curb, holding a small flashlight he had brought from home. Eli was 8, freckle-faced, hair perpetually falling into his eyes, clutching the light with both hands as if it were important. His mother, Kara Turner, stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder. Kara was in her early 30s, dark-haired, practical, a single parent who worked nights at the cannery. She knelt to Eli's height and whispered something. Eli took a step forward, then stopped at the edge of the curb, switching the flashlight on and setting it down. Beam pointed gently toward the open bay door. "For the dog," he said, then hurried back to his mother. No one laughed, no one corrected him. The afternoon passed in measured increments. Dr. Moore checked in and out, medics rotated quietly. Ranger woke and slept again, allowing the bandage to remain, allowing hands nearby so long as Jake stayed within his line of sight. When a truck backfired down the street, Ranger tensed, then relaxed when nothing followed. Each time he settled again, it felt like a collective exhale. Jake's watch read hours past his shift start. He imagined the warehouse supervisor's expression, the note that would be made. He imagined the consequences and accepted them. He had chosen this place. The town had chosen it too. As evening approached, Dr. Moore gathered Sarah and Jake near the supply table. "We have a window," she said. "If we transport him after sunset, when the roads are clear and the clinic quiet, we can anesthetize him safely. The team is ready. The equipment is ready." What made this possible was time. Sarah glanced toward the door, where blankets and lights marked a boundary of care. They gave us that. Outside, as dusk settled, people began to leave one by one, not in disappointment, but completion. They took their lamps and thermoses with them, leaving the quiet behind intact. Marjorie Hill returned briefly to straighten the blankets, then waved and went home. Louis tipped his hat and cut the generator on his work lamp, trusting the light inside to be enough. Ranger stirred as the sky darkened, lifting his head once. Jake met his gaze and stayed still. The town's patience had done its work. When the transport team arrived, the street was clear. The engine noise was low. Doors closed softly. Ranger allowed the stretcher without protest, eyes flicking once to the open bay door, then back to Jake. Jake stood and placed his hand on the wall instead of the dog, grounding himself. "We're ready," Dr. Moore said. Jake nodded. He had been since morning. As the ambulance rolled out, there was no crowd to part, no applause to quiet. Just a clear road and the sense that something fragile had been carried carefully enough to survive. The town returned to its rhythms. Jake finally checked his phone and began to walk, consequences waiting, but lighter than before. Ranger had endured, and he had not done it alone. The operating room was smaller than Jake had imagined. It wasn't the sterile, high-ceiling space people pictured when they thought of surgery. It was a converted wing inside the Regional Veterinary Center, clean and efficient, but modest. Steel tables, overhead lamps, instrument trays aligned with quiet precision. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm electronics. Outside the door, the town had gone dark for the night, choosing sleep after a day of deliberate waiting. Ranger was brought in slowly. His front leg was stabilized, bandaged carefully. The temporary work done by Dr. Moore and her team holding just enough to make this possible. His body moved stiffly now, fatigue finally overtaking vigilance. Still, his eyes remained alert, tracking changes in sound and shadow with disciplined awareness. Metal trays were adjusted near the table. The sound was small, a simple clink, but it cut through Ranger like a blade. His body tensed instantly, muscles tightened, his breathing sharpened. The low hum of stress returned, not as aggression, but as readiness. Years of training had taught him that metal sounds in closed rooms meant transitions. Gear changes, restraints, moments when control passed out of his hands. A technician froze. Dr. Helen Moore lifted her hand without speaking. At 63, she moved with economical grace, silver hair tucked neatly away, eyes steady behind thin lenses. She had seen this reaction before, in police dogs, rescue dogs, military K9s. The moment when procedure threatened trust. "We pause," she said calmly. No restraints. A younger surgical assistant, Mark Feldman, hesitated near the anesthesia cart. Mark was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered with dark hair cropped short, beard trimmed close to his jaw. He had come from a trauma unit where speed often mattered more than consent. His instincts leaned toward control. "He could bolt," Mark said quietly. "He could," Dr. Moore agreed. "Or he could choose." Jake stood just inside the doorway, arms relaxed at his sides. He had followed Ranger here without asking, without being told. No one had stopped him. Sarah Klein stood farther back, leaning against the wall, tall frame silhouetted under the dim hallway lights. Her auburn hair was braided now, a practical choice after too many loose strands had fallen into her eyes earlier. She looked tired but grounded, someone who had learned when to step forward and when to let others stand where they belonged. Jake did not approach Ranger. He did not speak. He simply stayed where he was. Ranger's head turned slowly. His eyes found Jake immediately. Not searching, anchoring. The tension in Ranger's body did not vanish, but it shifted. His weight redistributed. Instead of bracing away from the table, he stepped, one careful pace, then another, until the uninjured side of his body pressed lightly against Jake's leg. Jake felt the contact through denim and muscle, warm, solid, intentional. He did not move to hold Ranger. He did not steady him. He did not reach down. He let Ranger lean. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't fear-driven seeking. It was a decision. Ranger adjusted his stance, aligning himself so his injured leg was protected, his stronger shoulder resting against Jake's thigh. His breathing slowed by degrees. The hum in his chest softened. He stayed standing, upright, choosing proximity rather than flight. Dr. Moore watched closely. This was not submission. This was consent. "Proceed," she said quietly. The anesthesia mask was introduced slowly, deliberately, never blocking Ranger's view of Jake. Mark moved with controlled care now, recalibrating his instincts. The machine's rhythm steadied. Ranger inhaled once, then again. His eyes stayed open longer than expected, fixed on Jake's face. Jake lowered himself slightly, bringing his face closer, not looming, not retreating. "You're not being taken," Jake said softly. "You're stepping forward." Ranger's ears flicked once. His body relaxed into the contact. When sleep finally claimed him, it did so gently, without struggle. His weight eased away from Jake, transferred carefully onto the table by steady hands. Jake stepped back only when there was nothing left for Ranger to choose. The surgery lasted longer than planned. Metal was cut away from muscle. Tissue was cleaned, repaired, reinforced. Dr. Moore worked methodically, her hands sure, voice calm, as she narrated each step for the younger staff. Damage had been serious, but not catastrophic. Tendons were bruised, not severed. Blood loss had been managed just in time. At last, Dr. Moore straightened. "The leg is intact," she said. "Function will return. With time." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. The breath she released almost a laugh. Mark leaned against the counter, shoulders slumping as adrenaline drained away. Jake sat alone in the hallway while the room was cleaned, hands clasped loosely, eyes on the floor. He did not pray. He did not bargain. He simply waited, the same way Ranger had waited, the same way he had learned to wait long ago. When Ranger was wheeled out into recovery, wrapped in blankets, breathing slow and steady, Jake stood. The choice had been made, and it had not been forced. The call from the cold storage warehouse came 2 mornings after Ranger's surgery, timed with the kind of precision that suggested it had been discussed before the number was dialed. Jake answered it while standing in the narrow hallway outside the recovery ward, phone pressed to his ear, the smell of disinfectant still clinging to his clothes. The voice on the other end belonged to a supervisor he had known for years, a man named Dennis Ward, early 50s, thick-set, perpetually flushed, with a trimmed mustache and a way of speaking that avoided eye contact even over the phone. Dennis was not unkind. He was careful. And careful men, Jake had learned, rarely bent rules when bending cost them something. "We can't keep covering missed shifts," Dennis said, tone even, almost apologetic. "I know where you were, I do, but policy's policy." Jake leaned his shoulder against the wall and listened without interrupting. He could picture Dennis's office clearly, the chipped desk, the framed safety notices, the calendar no one ever updated. He could picture the line already written next to his name. "I understand," Jake said. There was a pause on the other end. "I'm sorry," Dennis added, quieter now. "If things were different, they're not," Jake replied, and ended the call before either of them had to say more. He stood there a moment longer, phone still in his hand, feeling the weight of what he had known was coming. The warehouse had been his last steady thing. Without it, the math of his life shifted sharply. Rent, utilities, groceries. The small emergency fund he kept, folded inside a coffee tin, would not last long. Jake put the phone away and went back inside. Ranger lay on a padded mat near the window, his front leg wrapped in a clean splint, the fur around it shaved down to pale skin. He looked smaller like this, stripped of harness and purpose, reduced to breathing and healing. His eyes opened when Jake entered, tracking him with slow recognition. There was no tension now, no guarding posture. just awareness. "You're awake," Jake said softly, settling into the chair beside him. Ranger's tail did not wag. It shifted once, a small movement that felt earned. The rehabilitation began that afternoon. Dr. Helen Moore supervised the first session herself, hands clasped behind her back as Ranger was guided into a standing position. His muscles trembled immediately, unused to the redistribution of weight. A physical therapist named Lena Perez assisted, mid-30s, athletic build, dark hair pulled into a tight braid, calm eyes that missed very little. Lena had worked with injured service dogs before. She spoke in clear, steady sentences and touched only when necessary. "Short and slow," she said. "We stop before pain teaches him the wrong lesson." Ranger took one step, then another. His injured leg shook violently, then held. Jake stayed close but did not hover, kneeling a few feet. Away, ready but not interfering. "That's enough," Lena said after less than a minute. "Good work." Ranger lowered himself immediately, breathing hard, eyes searching Jake's face. Jake nodded once, recognition passing between them. Some days, one step would be all there was. The days settled into a pattern that offered little comfort and no guarantees. In the mornings, Jake walked from the small room he had been allowed to sleep in, a converted office with a narrow cot and a blanket that smelled faintly of detergent, to Ranger's side. He helped where he was asked, stepped back where he wasn't. The afternoons were for therapy. Evenings were quiet, marked by the soft sounds of the ward settling and the occasional murmur of staff finishing late shifts. Money tightened quickly. Jake made careful lists in his head, crossing items off before he allowed himself to think about them. He sold a set of old tools he'd been saving. He canceled a phone plan upgrade he had been considering for months. He ate whatever was available in the hospital cafeteria and told himself it was temporary. Ranger's progress came unevenly. Some days, he pushed himself too hard, muscles remembering old strength that the body could not yet support. Lena would intervene gently, guiding him back down before strain turned into setback. Other days, Ranger refused to stand at all, lying still with his head turned away from the mat, eyes dull with frustration. On those days, Jake stayed beside him longer, not coaxing, not correcting. "You don't owe today anything," Jake would say quietly. "Tomorrow's still there." Sarah Klein stopped by when she could, often at the end of long shifts coordinating cleanup efforts across town. She looked different now, less tense, her auburn hair often left loose, her movements slower, as if the emergency pace had finally released her. She was tall and lean, skin lightly tanned beneath freckles, eyes thoughtful. She brought updates from outside, none of them urgent. "They asked about you at the marina," she told Jake one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe. "People noticed you stayed." Jake shrugged lightly. "I didn't do anything." Sarah smiled faintly. "That's not how they see it." At night, when the ward quieted, Jake sometimes felt the doubt creep in. He would sit with his back against the wall, watching Ranger sleep, and wonder if staying had been the right choice. The cost was real now. There was no pay waiting at the end of this, no promise of stability. He thought of the warehouse floor, the steady hum of refrigeration units, the predictability of routine. Then Ranger would shift in his sleep, breathing deepening, leg twitching once as if testing a boundary in a dream. Jake would remember the night in the clinic, the choice made without force, and the doubt would loosen its grip. They were both learning how to begin again. One evening, Ranger surprised everyone. Lena had prepared the mat, expecting another short session. Ranger stood without prompting, weight distributed carefully, eyes fixed on Jake. He took 3 steps, uneven, cautious, but deliberate, before wobbling and sitting down hard. The room went still. "That's progress," Lena said, unable to hide her smile. "Even if it doesn't look pretty." Jake crouched beside Ranger, resting a hand on the floor near his shoulder without touching. "That's enough for today," he said. Ranger's ears flicked, the tension easing from his jaw. Jake felt something shift inside himself at the same time. The job he had lost still mattered. The bills still waited. But there was a different accounting happening now. One that measured days not by wages, but by whether either of them had moved forward at all. They had not left. And neither had failed. The meeting was held in the town hall on a Tuesday evening, chosen not for ceremony, but because it was the one night the fishermen were in and the cannery lines shut down early. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old varnish. Folding chairs filled quickly, not with urgency, but with intention. People sat shoulder to shoulder, coats draped over knees, voices low. This was not a crisis gathering. It was a decision. Jake stood near the back at first, hands in his pockets, weight resting on his heels. He had not come expecting anything. He had been asked to attend, told only that it concerned next steps. Ranger lay beside him on a padded mat, front leg still wrapped but stronger now, the line of his shoulders beginning to square again as muscle returned. His coat had regained some of its sheen. He looked older than he had before the injury, not in years, but in gravity, the look of someone who had crossed a line and come back altered. Sarah Klein stood at the front with a folder tucked under her arm. She wore a simple sweater and dark jeans, auburn hair pulled back loosely, freckles visible under the warm lights. She looked less like an emergency coordinator now, and more like what she had always been beneath it, a woman who knew how to listen before she spoke. When the room settled, she took a breath. "We're not here to relive what happened," she said. "We're here to decide what happens next." She nodded to a man seated at the first table. Thomas Reed rose slowly. He was in his early 60s, tall with a narrow frame, gray hair combed back carefully, glasses perched low on his nose. He had served on the town council for over a decade and had once been a Navy machinist before settling here. His voice carried the steadiness of someone used to engines and long hours. "We've established a joint fund," Thomas said. "Veterans and working K-9s. It's small, but it's ours. Seated by the marina, the school district, the cannery, and private donations. No headlines, no strings." A murmur moved through the room, not surprise, but recognition. People nodded. Some looked at Jake, others looked at Ranger. "We're also offering a position," Thomas continued. "Facilities maintenance, harbor properties, public buildings, full-time, stable hours, benefits." Jake felt the words land with a weight he hadn't anticipated. He shifted his stance, instinctively glancing down at Ranger. Ranger's ears flicked, attentive but calm. "You'd be good at it," Thomas added, not as persuasion, but as fact. "And we'd like Ranger to stay with you, officially." Dr. Helen Moore stood next, hands folded. "Ranger is eligible for honorable retirement," she said. "Medical clearance pending final review. Long-term care is recommended. Familiar handler, low-stress environment." There it was, the thing that had hovered without being spoken aloud. Jake stepped forward then, slow, deliberate. He did not reach for the microphone. He did not look for the right words. "I don't know how to accept this," he said honestly, "but I will." That was enough. The paperwork took weeks. The transition took longer. Jake finished the last of his obligations at the clinic, helped Ranger through final assessments, learned the quiet routines of recovery that would become habit. Ranger's legs strengthened, his gait smoothed. He still favored it on cold mornings, but he moved without hesitation now, eyes clear, posture relaxed in a way Jake recognized as readiness without burden. They moved into the house at the edge of town, just as spring began to soften the harbor air. It was small. One story, white siding, weathered by salt. A narrow porch with a railing that leaned slightly to the left. The yard was fenced, not for confinement, but for safety. A square of grass bordered by a young maple, and a stretch of dirt that would eventually become something green. Inside, the floors creaked. The kitchen window looked east, catching the morning light. Jake slept on a mattress on the floor the first week, listening to the sounds of a place not yet learned. Ranger paced at night at first, moving from room to room, checking corners, nose-brushing baseboards. Jake did not stop him. Some habits needed to run their course. The new job began quietly. Maintenance schedules, broken hinges, rusted locks, leaking faucets. Jake worked alone most days, sometimes with an apprentice from the vocational school, a young man named Caleb Monroe, early 20s, tall and thin with restless hands and a constant curiosity. Caleb asked questions. Jake answered when it mattered. Ranger came along when appropriate, lying in patches of sun or watching doors with soft focus. No vest, no harness, just presence. The town adjusted around them without comment. People waved, they offered coffee. They asked Ranger how his leg was doing, as if it were a shared responsibility. Jake learned to nod, to thank, to let it be enough. Weeks passed. One morning, sunlight crept across the bedroom floor, bright and insistent. The house was quiet, too quiet. Jake woke with a start, heart already ahead of thought. He reached for the edge of the bed and sat up, scanning the room. No pacing, no alert posture, no watchful eyes fixed on the door. Ranger lay on the rug near the window, stretched on his side, chest rising and falling in deep, even rhythm. His paws twitched once, chasing something harmless in sleep. His ears were relaxed, folded loosely back. Jake checked the clock. Late. The realization arrived slowly, without drama. There had been no sound to wake him because there had been no need. No watch kept, no threat monitored, no perimeter held. Jake leaned back against the wall and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Ranger stirred at the exhale, lifting his head, eyes soft. He looked at Jake, then rested his chin back on the rug, content. Jake smiled then, not wide, not loud, just enough. The last watch had ended. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or flashing light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through patience, through neighbors who show up without being asked, through a tired man who chooses not to walk away, and through a dog who finally learns he is safe. Jake and Ranger didn't heal because life suddenly became easy. They healed because a community chose kindness over urgency, presence over pressure, and love over convenience. And perhaps that is how God works most often, not by removing the storm, but by sending the right hearts to stand with us while it passes. As Christmas draws near, this story reminds us that none of us are meant to carry our burdens alone. Whether you're healing from loss, waiting for peace, or simply trying to make it through another day, know this: God sees you. He hasn't forgotten your watch. And rest will come. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read everyone. And if you believe in stories of compassion, courage, and second chances, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you and your family this Christmas season. May He grant you peace, healing, and the quiet miracle of knowing you are never alone.